Well, hello everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our webinar entitled Global Talent Mobility is Key for Enterprise Acceleration in a Pandemic World. We're thrilled to be joined today by Holger Mueller, Principal Analyst and Vice President of Constellation Research, and our very own Steve Black, Co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer here at Topia. There will be an interactive Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. Please feel free to drop any questions into the chat. And without further ado, I shall hand over to our speakers.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for the introduction, Holly, and it's good to be here with you, Steve. I noticed there's not much black with you right now. It's more the dark blue of Topia.
Yeah, exactly. Good to be here as well. Looking forward to the conversation, Holger.
And climate change is happening, right? I'm in San Diego. I'm wearing a jacket, and you're in the UK. You're wearing a t-shirt, right?
I am. It's a heat wave over here, so we'll take it.
Good for you guys. So not much further ado. Do you want to tell something about you, Steve?
No, I think maybe the quick relevant intro for folks based in the UK, as you mentioned there, my accent is a dead giveaway that I'm from the US originally. So I did the classic expat move 13 years ago now, nearly, of temporarily, in air quotes there, moving from Chicago to London for work. And as these things happen, extended it a few times, met my future wife over here, and have settled to the UK to be home. I think it was really through that first mobility experience, firsthand moving around the world myself, that I figured that there was a lot of improvement that could be done to that process, both for individuals and for organizations. So I've spent the better part of the last decade now working to build out Topia and help really transform the experience for individuals and also for organizations. So looking forward to talking through that today.
I need to speak to your language coach. Maybe our wives have to speak, because I did the opposite thing. I moved from Germany 21 years ago. So we're both products of global talent mobility, but people still think I live in Germany for my accent. So.
It's a tough one. I've got a five-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I'll often get corrected because I'm saying words incorrectly. So it never goes away.
Maybe it's the kids who bring you there, right? I haven't been there. Right, and Constellation Research covered 2 areas: future of work and next generation application. Here it's really relevant that we speak about future of work, which is when we work, how we work, what tools do we use, what motivates us to work. And obviously today we talk about global talent mobility. And we have a quick chat or quick survey pulse for you guys going on. It's going to be activated right now. The question is, how aligned is your talent management strategy with your global mobility function? Meaning, like, is your talent management looking into global talent in your enterprise? And the 3 options are minimally aligned, right? Mobility is purely operational, so it's been done by hand, by spreadsheets and so on. Partially aligned is sometimes involved strategic talent planning, and highly aligned, where mobility is core part of your talent strategy, planning and delivery.
I'm interested to see, we'll give folks a few seconds here to respond. It'll be interesting to see, we run this poll a few times at a number of different events, some more mobility focused, some more HR leadership focused. So it's always interesting to see how different people around the globe feel about the topic of mobility and how it's working in their organization.
Right. Well, it's obviously clearly important who's attending, what the background is. Oh, and the results are in. We are in the middle of the road, basically, right? So 50% of you said they're partially aligned, which I think really reflects the reality for most companies, right? I would be a little suspicious if everybody would be fully aligned as core part of the core talent strategy, which very few companies have achieved. So, and 40% say it's purely operational, right? So interesting results coming back. Any comments from you, Steve?
Yeah, I think it's certainly that highly aligned bucket is always the smallest, generally, 10, 15% max. I think a lot of aspiration to get there, and we'll talk a little bit today about how we've seen some organizations make that leap. Probably a little bit more in the minimally aligned bucket than some of the conversations I've had before. But I think to your point, it depends a little bit on the profile of folks in the audience. But I think, excited to dig in and really talk about some of that journey, right, some of that transformation. So,
and of course, how honest people are, right? So, but I think we captured it pretty well here. So let's talk about what's really happening for enterprise. And in Constellation, we give you a framework of the 4 major changes which are happening, right? One of them, of course, is macro trends. Those are the things as an enterprise you cannot determine, right? This is when will, for example, because Steve's in the UK, when will Brexit really happen, right? Who's going to be voted to become the next president of the United States and fall out this year, right? This is things where you have to react to, but you want to monitor them, right? The ones closer, and keep in mind, this is general advice for boards and for chief executives, the dynamic workforce, where you as a listener working most likely in the HR space, right, are a keen specialist to know what is happening in the workforce, what motivates people to work, how many generations are there, how do you acquire people, what makes them happy. And then, of course, what we talk about here, technology is changing things more rapidly than ever before. And how does technology change best practices? And then it creates often new digital business models or new digital best practices. And we're in the digital best practices compartment area here with talking about global talent mobility and how it can help, right? So you have an example for the Steve.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think speaking of those macro trends, right, I think if anything 2020 has taught us is change is the new normal, right? I remember fondly the days when Brexit was the main topic of conversation, and how the world has changed since just the beginning of this year, right? And I think we've seen organizations go through quite the journey in a very accelerated time frame of how to deal with a developing crisis from a health and safety perspective, how to adjust, how to plan, how to replan. And also then I think interesting, the evolution of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a topic that's come up from time to time over the years, diversity and inclusion, a hot topic, particularly in the world of talent mobility as well. And it's been very interesting to see how organizations have started to respond on that front. But I think across the board, right, the theme is agility, responsiveness, and needing data and information, right, at your fingertips to help work through those uncertainties. And, if anything else, I think everyone is aligned that, stability isn't coming anytime soon. So we've got to get used to it.
Absolutely, right. And what happens is all these things, COVID, diverse inclusion, the Black Lives Matter movement, all these things have a regulatory exhaust and overhaul, which companies have to address, right? And this makes it harder for them, which means they have to move faster, they have to become more agile. And their agility doesn't come just from pros, their agility comes from people. And getting the people in the right place is a fundamental and key aspect here, right? So
absolutely.
From measuring how these things are getting faster, right? One objective way, because speed is always relative, right? You see a car driving by and you say, oh, that was fast. And then you watch Formula One and say, oh, that's a little faster. But there's no other cars, right? So there are always questions. So one great way to gauge the change that's happening is by looking at the publicly traded financial indices, right? So in 52%, that's often been quoted, often been used, we found that first 52% of the Fortune 500 in the US index are gone since 2000, right? Then we looked into, is this like just the index, right? But only the small number of the Dow Jones are still part of the Dow Jones. And if you look over in Europe, right, the largest economy in Germany, right, there's 100% turnover in the DAX, which is the Frankfurt financial markets, in 30 years, right? If you look over to you in the UK, right, over 260 members of the FTSE have been gone since 1984, which seems a long time on the one side, but on the other side, if you look at the company names, they're household names. You look over in Japan, right, a very slow-moving economy right now, unfortunately for the Japanese, right? There's still 210 of the 225 new since 1950. So even there, that is happening. Last but not least, again, back to the US, the average age of a company joining the S&P 500 in 2013 was 10 years old, right? So this is a major change in that. Jump in, Steve.
No, absolutely. And I think it's that this change is the only certainty, right, on top of death and taxes, perhaps. And I think we've seen that speed and that rate of change and that volatility, right, only continues to increase. So it'll be interesting to see what these numbers look like even in a few more years, because I think that turnover of organizations, top organizations leading, very few can do it for multiple decades or a generation, which used to be a bit more of the norm, right?
Absolutely right. The key thing to understand is not necessarily these companies have gone out of business. They just have grown fast enough to be part of it, right? Example from Germany here, like Lufthansa, who's always been part of the DAX, just fell out of the DAX because nobody's flying, right? They're not gone, they might come back, but this shows the turmoil and the change that's happening. I like your point from that. But nonetheless, there's three mega trends, which still COVID, Black Lives Matter, civil rights things are still there, right? Globalization is not going to stop, right? So it's the strongest business trend, fueling the global economy since World War II, right? And it might be going faster, it might be going slower, but globalization is not coming to an end. digitalization is stronger than ever before, right? There's this great joke, I saw that on Twitter yesterday. Who did more for digital transformation? The CEO, the CIO, the Chief Digital Information Officer, or the COVID officer, which of course is like a joke, saying that COVID changed more of that, right? Because for the first time ever, the world is aligned on the same thing, because the virus travels everywhere and the virus is democratic and makes people sick all over the world. So the reaction is pretty much the same, and it pulls more digitalization enterprise. And the other key one, that's more an argument for the first world countries, is an aging population, right? So we're running out of hands to do the work. This is why I'm optimistic on automation. People will want to look for any automation that helps them. We're moving very quickly in the first world from 6 people to 1 retired person to 2 people for 1 retired person. So it's unimaginable change was happening. And to my Italian heritage, despite my German accent, I grew up in Italy. I always joke with this old lady. Anybody knows what the 2 fingers mean? It's cornuto, right? She's cheating on her partner. So she's lolly, she's leisurely old living person. Right? Good for her.
It's amazing. And I think that that's absolutely true. You know, you layer on also the fact that there's now really 4 generations in the workforce, right? Working simultaneously next to each other. The automation that you talked about is going to mean, 100+ million jobs around the world, and individuals are going to need reskilling, right? They're not going to be out of the workforce, but the job they used to do will change.
Exactly.
Right? And I think that is absolutely at the center of digitization and those transformations. And again, that pace is only going to continue to increase.
Yes, absolutely right. Very good point, right? Globalization, like I said, strongest business trend ever. We won't stop flying the planes. We won't stop the global economy. But then the impact of that, right? That's something you want to talk about, Steve,
yeah,
right?
I think the interesting thing that we've seen with globalization has been this massive evolution and transformation of the global mobility function, right? Go back 20 years ago, and mobility was really responsible for a handful handpicked senior executives being sent around the world on these multi-million-dollar expat packages. And that was what mobility owned: super high touch, white glove service for your most senior execs. And then we've had this increasing pace of change of the evolution of new policy types, right? And more individuals experiencing mobility. So the introduction of short-term assignments or long-term assignments, maybe that didn't have the full, tax benefits that the C-suite execs were getting. And then we moved into permanent transfers being owned and managed by a mobility function. So no longer did it have to be an assignment. When I moved from Chicago to London, it was a one-way move. I didn't have this nice lavish package. I got help along the way. But then I was treated like a local from that perspective.
Yeah.
Then we saw the next sort of world for mobility was working with recruiting teams. So this increase in globalization led to cross-border recruiting, cross-border hiring. We'll see what, some of the legal changes happening in the US due to some of that here in the short term. And then as we got into, if that wasn't enough in terms of new responsibilities, as we were getting into 2020, what we really saw was business travel and the compliance and risk management of that was on the cusp of landing in the lap of mobility to manage and to own. For years, we've been talking about that topic. Sometimes it sits with mobility, more often it sits with tax or compliance, or doesn't really have an owner. And so, at the start of the year, I was sure this was the year that business travel and compliance around it was going to go towards mobility. Obviously, we live in very strange times where business travel stopped around the globe for a few months. But I think the interesting thing that we saw was we almost went one step further, where mobility now needs to understand the location and the implications of remote work across what could be 100% of your workforce, right? You look at what Jack Dorsey said it from a Twitter perspective of folks don't have to come back into the office if they don't want to. And we've heard that echoed many, many times. There was a PwC report I saw earlier today that had over 50% of CFOs thought that remote working would be an official policy from here going forward. But what that means, and I think oftentimes what some of those C-level execs might not have thought about when they were making the statements around this new world of work, was mobility teams have to understand where home is, because if working from home is actually working across a state line or a country line, all of a sudden you've got tax exposure and payroll implications that you need to be considering. So this just, exponential growth in the responsibility of mobility teams, which is exciting, great opportunity, but also a lot of pressure, right? As the world changes.
As well as working hours, right? Don't email a person in France after 5 p.m. or 6 p.m., right? So there's a lot of regulatory things to consider about it. But the key is really enterprises have to find global talent. Who can do what? Right? Only because we didn't have the internet for us to do this call with you in the UK and me in San Diego 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that's when we had to fly and move people and think about the short-term assignments or longer-term assignments and so on, because you want to have people in one room. Now we don't have to have this. You still have to find the talent and understand the legal repercussions on that.
Absolutely. And then I think the last piece here, there's a bunch of pressure also adding to this complexity. So it's one thing that now you're responsible for 80+% of the population in terms of understanding compliance. You then have things, GDPR was the buzzword a couple of years ago. It's now, posted worker directive in Europe finally going into effect. And also we're seeing governments finally have the data to start cracking down on maybe compliance rules and regulations that have been in place for years, but were hard to enforce. You then have this extreme cost pressure. I saw another study recently around CFO investment in technology. And in many cases, that investment with technology was to drive down cost in other parts of the business, right? Whether it's procurement software or other things. But along the way, and I know we'll talk about it in part of our conversation today, this employee experience, this core of talent management, that at the end of the day, you need the best and brightest people and you need to keep them for as long as you can. That's not going away, right? And I think that is a key tenet that everyone is thinking about in the midst of all this complexity, all this cost pressure and all this change. How do we make sure that we retain the best talent so that we can be the most competitive as an organization?
Yeah, and perfectly well said around the agile expectations, right? Things have to move faster, have to be accelerated, no question about that, right? And so what we publish is we talk about 9 drivers which HR can use to accelerate, right? So one of the key things is that HR has to become more business user-centric, because for an enterprise to be agile, it's not about supporting the chief executive, the boardroom. It's not about also supporting the individual. It's all about supporting the first and second line managers who move the needle. So becoming more business user-centric is key. Right? We have the second revolution of infinite computing with big data, that enterprise for the first time can store everything that's digitally available, both the artifacts and the exhaust, and ask questions about this, right? It has to be big data enabled, has to make part of the cheap compute from the cloud with machine learning. There has to be a new way of recruiting, which is lean, where I think the hiring manager has to be empowered to find the best talent, which is supported by something I'm writing and talking about since a long time, the talent depth chart. Why is it that an enterprise does not know where is the best person for a job, right? This might be a person in the company, this might be a person outside of the company, this might be a gig worker, right? Because there's not a permanent need for that. And then you have to be faster at moving people. I coined the term of transboarding. We'll talk about this a little more in detail. Make sure between transfers and onboarding. There's so much talk on onboarding, but I never expect from somebody who's new hire to be right away productive. But if I relocate somebody half around the world, I want them to hit the ground running because I know the company, that our processes. So transfers outnumber onboarded usually by 5 to 7 occasions in the company. So there's not enough support for that. You have to fix performance management. That's a big story for itself. You have to improve learning for people to know the new things. Very important for enterprises which know that they will not come back in the same way with the same value chain like before the pandemic. And has to be non-monolithic. There have to be different ways of doing business. Our focus today is in the middle section, right? How to find the talent in a faster way, how to identify that, and how to move in the right place.
Absolutely. And I think it's key to do that with this lens. And you talked on a slide earlier around the sort of disconnected sort of nature of many of the systems and platforms. And for me, there is this complexity inherent in most enterprises today where we all talk a lot about having maybe one HCM system globally. And I think we know in reality, many large organizations still have this patchwork of systems, depending on region, depending on geography. And that makes, all 9 of these, and particularly the 3 that you're talking about in the middle, incredibly complex when the systems that you have that hold a lot of this talent data don't talk to each other, right? And then, countless stories of organizations that have to, fire an employee in one system and then rehire them in the next system. And you've lost, potentially years of relevant talent data and insight and learning about that individual, right? It just adds a huge amount of risk and makes it much harder to find, where is your depth chart? What's the information about them? And who's the right person for this role, whether local or halfway around the world?
Yeah. Somebody coined at some point, behind global payroll, there's always a sweatshop behind it, right? But the same thing is true for global mobility, where emails, chat, post-it notes, letters, it's a labor of love, or it's a sweatshop, which makes global talent mobility really happening, right?
Yeah.
Very good point, right? But you want to talk about a little about how it's connected to talent strategy, Steve?
Yeah. And I think mobility is really always been an interesting one for me because of how it can impact the entire employee lifecycle, the entire talent management lifecycle. While it doesn't own many of the pieces, it can influence and make them better or worse, right? So if you think about where I've seen organizations do this really well, is tying mobility very tightly to the recruiting teams, right? Mm-hmm. So in helping, because recognizing, particularly when there's a cross-border recruitment effort happening, you're not only selling them on the job and the company, which is tough anyway, you're also selling them, potentially their family, their partner, their children, on the location. So you might win on company, you might win on job, but if you've got there's too much anxiety on location, you can lose a wonderful candidate. And so getting that closer and selling the location can be key. Similarly, as you think about deploying, engaging talent around the world, one of the things you often see a struggle with is, these pulse surveys and systems and tools out there in talent management often may miss the individuals that are out on assignment because they're bouncing between, your list of employees by region. But in reality, those are the people that you're spending the most money in investing in their development by sending them around the world, and have the highest risk of becoming disengaged as they change managers, they change locations, and even simple acts like a going away party as they leave and finish their assignment and head back home, done poorly, can feel like a goodbye party as they move on to the next organization and start to plant seeds of a departure and that sort of thing. So it's interesting because that mobility can help make all of these better, or done poorly can make them worse. But however, the mobility team doesn't actually own or have full responsibility for each of those areas. So one of the questions I actually had for you was, wanted to hear a little bit of your perspective around why you think it is that, maybe, some of the existing HCM solutions haven't sort of gone a bit deeper into the space of mobility, and, what you think about that sort of partial ownership without full ownership means for mobility teams having a real impact.
Yeah, it's the classic story of the long tail, right? So when you build software, you want to automate the things which everybody uses, right? And there's more exotic things which you don't get to, or which few people use, right? And those users, those business people who have to perform these functions, they're basically in a very difficult state, right? Because the area might be so specific and may not even attract startups to do that, right? The lucky situation is for global talent mobility, it attracted a few startups in the space, right? So because you just don't want to have one and no competition, because then there's no good software either, right? Competition is the lifeblood of good software, right? So luckily this area is big enough and we're talking about this, right? But there's endless parts which have not been automated. And the really only solution then is to roll up your sleeves and to look for some low-code, no-code tools and see to implement themselves. Luckily, you don't have to do this here because it's a very complex part. I don't see a company developing their own internal talent mobility solution, apart from maybe some robotic process automation or so. But luckily, there's something there. But the secret is software companies are there to solve software. And the more horizontal, the more commonly used it is, the better. And global talent mobility is not mainstream, right? And we have our next poll question coming up potentially on that. So
yeah, I think that was a bit early. We'll come on to that.
Okay, no worries. No, we hold our horses. There's an about poll coming. Don't be nervous.
That's
Good.
Right.
Yeah. Good.
Great. Yeah.
So moving along, right? So on the transporting part, as I promised you, to have a little more drill down, because the word might be new for you listening to it, right? Mixture of transfer and onboarding. What does it mean if you look at the functionality behind there, right? You have to find global talent, right? This is a huge issue for most companies. I don't know who's working for me, often in different locations in the same country, right? Personally, right, I had the unfortunate situation one of my first years in the US of two very good people resigning from my team, and they just wanted to have each other's job. So I managed to salvage one of them and said, like, why didn't you talk to me? So manager failure from my side, right? So the easiest thing of transporting was happening right in front of me, and I didn't pick it up because of a lack of communication. How harder is it if it's beyond the location, in the country, globally, right? And the important thing is you want to widen the talent pool, right? There's so many jobs, and we have the immigration discussion, for instance, right now. Why does the US get H-1Bs, H-2Bs, L-1s in the country, right? And there's a qualification part of it. You have to show as an employer that you can't find a US person who's qualified. Now, if that's done correctly all the time, who knows, right? But there's a wider talent pool that's going to help, right? And you have to reduce the friction, the transfer. We talked about this, right? You want to get rid of the Post-it notes, because if the Post-it note fell down to make the tax declaration for the employees leaving and was thrown away at night by the people cleaning the office, maybe there's going to be a tax penalty, right? And of course, you mentioned that with employee experience being more and more important, right? You might see a temporary dip, right, with unfortunately high unemployment numbers. That's becoming a little more an employer market who can choose from the talent. But long term, I don't expect this. It wasn't the same like half a year ago. It was completely employee markets. Employees can choose what they want to do. And you have to make the employee experience better in the whole process. You want to use a time advantage, right? If I do this properly and the person is working already for me, I want to train them, qualify them for the new job, right? Nothing's more expensive than transferring the person, say, oh, and now we have to teach you language, or now we have to teach you culture, or now we have to teach you our best practices here, right? Use that time advantage to accelerate faster. You want to have a fluid team transition, right? You want to have that person join, for instance, staff meetings of the future team where they're going to, as an example, understand the priorities, maybe do some work already. Learning is a huge part of this, right? Lifelong learning is what I strongly believe in anyway, so learning is always important. But for a transfer, it's even more important because you don't want to be there and identify yourself, what you should have learned, what your manager, what your team would have known. Oh yeah, the other people who came from there or did this with the background, they had to do this too, right? So why not anticipate that, right?
Absolutely.
Provide this mobile support, right? If you're moving, transferring, you might not have your laptop yet. It has to be mobile experience. I think it was great that you said it's a job for the family as well, and there's functions and benefits for the family in that part too. And you want to make it so frictionless as you can. Right? So quick outlook on the 9 functional main capabilities of transporting. Right? And basically,
yeah, I think it's a great topic, and I think I love the term. Right, it was a new one to me, but I love that. I've always seen mobility sitting at this intersection, right, of transferring and a lot of transition into onboarding. So that's a wonderful perspective.
Yeah, and I mean this is the picture which captures global talent mobility the best at least in goldfish level, right? If you can jump from one to the other goal, it doesn't have to be the emptier one. It should do some digital art and make it the prettier aquarium potentially, a better waterfall. But that's what you basically want to eliminate, that goldfish is jumping with confidence into the right talent pool, into the right location where to work. At the end of the day, when you abstract it back, right, it means that the speed of your enterprise has to be faster than the speed in the markets you're operating in. Because if you don't achieve that over time, you're going to have the fate of the companies which fell out all these indices. You will be in a very difficult position to capture anything and move that. And moving your internal talent is available instead of hiring somebody subpar or having a position open, which is crucial for you, is definitely going to help the speed of your enterprise.
Cool. Yeah, great. And I think, one of the things I know we're probably closing in on the half-hour mark here, and we'll save time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, but I think I would love to spend the last couple of minutes here talking about, some of your perspectives around the pandemic and how, organizations need to prepare to come out of the back of it.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Very important question from that perspective. There's a question on the chat, actually. I don't know if we want to take the act back, but there's a question on selling the location, which you said before, and I picked up on that, right? And the question is about, wouldn't it be better to help the partner to get a realistic expectation about opportunities for him, her in the new location, right? Obviously.
Yeah, it's a great comment, and I think the selling absolutely has to be honest selling, right? The worst thing you can do is convince someone that their life will be wonderful, perfect, and easy in a new location, and then have them get there and have it fail, right? A failed assignment is much more costly than someone saying no for all of the right reasons. So a lot of it is about understanding information. What's it going to be like? What's the language situation? What's the sort of expat community? But also then thinking about, from a policy design perspective, certainly the level of support that a partner and a family is going to need. So whether that's schooling, whether that's job finding services for partners, which we've seen some real positive uptake, or language lessons, for the family and cultural training. So I think it's about
school placement for children.
Absolutely. So I think if you get expectations right, you can help assuage some of the concerns, but honesty is absolutely the best policy for sure.
Right. Yeah. And what helps the most from my experience, having done lots of global transfers with the sticky tape and so on, is provide a buddy, a reference family who's done the same thing 1 or 2 years before, right? And tell them before, be honest, right? So tell them how it is. Don't sugarcoat it necessarily. Talk about the mistakes, talk about the things you've done. Yeah. That's highly helpful for someone who might be coming from a cultural work situation to hear from someone who just went for this, right? Highly valuable, right? So why not promote this if you've done this before in your enterprise?
Absolutely. And I think those can be some of the best ambassadors for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what do we do in the post-pandemic situation, right? How are you comfortable with being the person, this famous French lighthouse where the waves always crash into, but you can just put your hands in your pocket and calmly stand there because you know the lighthouse is going to protect you, right? The key thing is everything accelerates again, right? We're moving from 7-year to an extreme case 7-week cycles, right? 7 years we know really well from the economic cycles, right? We've been very lucky that the last economic expansion was more around 10, 11 years, depending how you count it, right? So but the 7-week cycle comes from the situation if you're a local business, customer facing, retail, food and beverage, tourism, right? The local regulation will tell you to open. You might have 2-3 weeks to open, and then something happens, the second wave, like we're unfortunately seeing in some locations right now, and you might have to shut down again, right? Take an iconic brand, take an Apple Store, right? They had less than 7 weeks to start up and to close again as Apple Storing some of them. So 3 weeks to open, 3 weeks to close, 1 week as a buffer is a new economic reality for many parts of the enterprise. And that means that everything has to move faster, which means you have a HR chorus renaissance where you need to know where your people are, which most companies don't know. They had to call people and managers. And if the manager didn't have a cell phone number, he couldn't call the person. Of course, your payroll has to be more flexible because there's different benefits and there's different things which have to be paid for. Benefits have to be more flexible. Other benefits play a huge role. Your workforce management has to be more agile. It becomes actually much more relevant as there are occupancy parts where all of a sudden white collar people who would never be reserving spaces or punching in. All of a sudden we have to punch in, say, look, we are at capacity. We can't have more people come. Please come back at 6. And people have left or something like this, right? Then, of course, the learning opportunities, we talked about this, and very key, of course, talent mobility, right? Your internal talent mobility is something which has been neglected, was super unfortunate because the tool should be there. But again, the focus to hire from the outside. And then, of course, global talent mobility we're talking about. The gig economy is very relevant for enterprise because you will not always scale at natural numbers of 1, 2, 3, but at fractional numbers of 0.25 capacity for a certain role. So the gig economy, contractors, freelancers, going to be very, very relevant, more relevant than before. And you have to find the talent as you pivot potentially and can't find all these people internally, globally or nationally. You have to find a faster way to get talent on board.
Yeah, and I think the exciting thing for me is the number of these boxes that global talent mobility touches, actually, right? It's going to touch, there's a huge new world of payroll compliance and cross state and country lines, agility, planning, replanning, right? All of those scenarios are going to include new locations. What do we do with the existing locations we have? To your point on talent mobility, it's been increasingly a trend to see career mobility, so changing jobs without changing location, combined with physical mobility under the same umbrella within an organization. Because I think organizations have started to realize that, you know, it's about the employee's career path. Sometimes the physical movement is up one floor, and sometimes it's, you know, 5,000 miles away in a different country. But if you can combine those from a data, from an insight perspective, it can unlock quite a bit more power in the employee's career and the employee's life cycle. So yeah, lots of change for sure, lots of pressure and a big spotlight on global talent mobility teams, but a real opportunity to have an impact as we start to figure out what new normal even looks like and how it's going to evolve.
Great point, Steve. It touches basically everything of the things you're saying here. Very good point. Yeah.
And so I think we'll close maybe on this survey, the next slide, if you want to go into it. Yeah. We'll run this one. We can spend a minute or two afterwards talking about it, and then we'll let people get back to their day. But Holly, if you want to pop up that survey question, the goal here is, you know, with the COVID pandemic evolving, wanting to understand from the audience how you see it impacting the importance of connecting your mobility function with broader talent management. So do you see, first answer, decreasing importance? So movement over the next few years will be limited and it's not as important strategically, similar level of importance or increased importance. So maybe even if movement isn't increasing, you know, finding, developing, moving top talent and the expanded role of mobility might be increasingly important. So we will give folks just a second here.
Yep.
See how it ties to the beginning. Increasing importance. Great. So two-thirds increasing, 1/3 same importance, and none on decreasing importance. So probably suggests we've got an audience of mobility folks who are excited about the opportunity ahead, which I think is wonderful, and, you know, certainly aligns with what I'm hearing in conversations I'm having with CHROs and executives, even in businesses where the number of people moving might be dropping due to budget constraints or commercial impacts from COVID, the importance for those that are still moving remains. And we've just added a whole host of health and safety compliance conversations for all of us that are now working from home around the world. So Holger, any closing thoughts from your perspective?
No, not a surprise, right? You might have self-selected the audience here, but there's no question that this has to be of more relevance and has to be connected better and has to help companies to move faster and achieve their goals. No question about it. So not surprised by the result, right? So should enterprises, what should people listening here, what are the success patterns to be successful for this, right? What's happening, I talk about this a lot, is the automation imperative, right? Companies have to automate no matter what, right? Since the first tool, the hammer, was founded, right? And you can build a matrix out of that, of the quality of automation and the affordability of automation, right? You could automate tons of things, but it's too expensive, right? Or it's not good enough quality for that. And what COVID has done is, right, it has moved that sweet spot down significantly to the left. So lower affordability, so more expensive things will have to be done because if you don't have the people, and you are ready to make more of a compromise on the quality because more important to have it than not have it at all, right? So the automation sweet spot has significantly moved in that direction from that perspective.
Absolutely, and we've seen that, with mobility teams going on furlough or shrinking in size due to layoffs. It's find a way to get it done. Not running payroll next month is not an answer to the organization. So yeah, lots of pressure there.
Yeah, good point. And the key thing is you have to find ways to find global talent, right? If you don't do this, you're not doing a fair job for your own people in your company from a worldwide basis. Why would you let go of people that you need in another country, place, if you could transfer them, as an example? Yeah. You know about that talent. Transporting the global talent, right? I took a trick from something that Hollywood has figured out, right? In Star Trek, right? They're zooming people, right? If only the head of global talent would be named Scotty, it would be all done, right?
Exactly.
So, but in a seamless, easeful, hopefully healthy way of getting the talent in place, that's the holy grail where you want to get to. And you have to get started with global talent faster and be agile like a cheetah on that. Anything you want to add, Steve?
No, I agree. I think there's a lot of exciting stuff to come, a lot for folks to think about, but a wonderful time to be in the space. I think the leadership is really looking at mobility for more data, more insight, more operational efficiency, of course, but a great time to be in the space and for mobility teams to sort of rise to the occasion.
Right, more relevant than ever before, no question.
Absolutely.
About it. And last but not least, don't do this by yourself, right? No matter what RPA vendors or low-code, no-code vendors are saying, there's a lot of compliance things which you cannot scale to, you don't want to scale to unless you want to become a software vendor as an enterprise. It shouldn't be your idea in the first place, unless it's your pivot out of COVID and saying, oh, we stop manufacturing, we're building software now, which maybe some people are even doing, we'll know in a few months. But look for vendors who are in the space. Topia obviously is one of them. To help you with this relatively important, very important and relatively complex task. So with that, we want to open it to Q&A.
Yeah, and I think I had some, Holly had chimed in, let me know. We hadn't had any additional questions come in from earlier. So I think we'll give folks the rest of their day back here. But Holger, appreciate the time today and the conversation. Lots of great insight. Wonderful.
Then let me ask you a question, Steve.
Yeah, go on.
If I put my HR leader, talent, mobility hat on, right? So if I would start with Topia or with anybody, right? What are the time frames? What's the process? What needs to happen? When can I see the first results?
Yeah, so I think the recommendation I always give organizations is thinking about, quick wins, right? And showing value back to the business as quickly as possible to gain momentum. So in today's space, the employee location tracking, state-to-state compliance, cross-border compliance, and payroll is an area that you can get up and running very, very quickly, integrate a couple of data sources and get going, solving some pain point, potentially saving some money in terms of paying the appropriate level of tax, not overpaying, showing value to the business very quickly. And then you can start to layer on and embed some of the more complex areas of, payroll calculations, payroll instructions, and whatnot. So from the tracking compliance perspective, that can be up and running. We've seen it in a matter of weeks, or certainly even no more than a couple of months, even for a very large enterprise. And then for a larger sort of full mobility program automation technology rollout, typical would be sort of 90 days, and that can plus or minus depending on the complexity of the organization and the transformation that's often going on at the same time. Maybe it's plugging into a new HCM that's rolling out and those sorts of things. But those are a couple of, I guess, windows that I think about.
Yeah, no, and this is a very good point. So the recommendation for us is always, if you implement enterprise software, you have to look for early success, right? The low-hanging fruit, because there's no time, there's no willingness for doing something which is long-term and producing results. And if you can have this quick wins, it's definitely a very good true north for any implementation, right? So yeah. What's the average time you see somebody going live on Topia?
I'd say these days it's with the recent launch of Topia 1, which is the next generation of the platform. It's dropped dramatically, and so it's 90 days or so is our typical target for a large enterprise, and for a smaller program, it could be 30, 45 days. And on the business travel tracking side of things, that's measured typically more in weeks. So quite a bit of flexibility and agility to get going, show that value. I think that's one of the things we've seen. The days of 12-month implementations and people don't have the patience. Organizations want to see that value quickly, and it's good to help win those hearts and minds and get organizations going on that transformation journey.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? Apart from the global talent mobility of transfers, right? Understanding then when business travel is picking up again with more complexity, because how long are you quarantined to go there, right? It's basically going to Europe from here is changing on a weekly basis, basically, right? I have a friend of mine who's Spanish who wants to go home and says, oh, this is odd, right? I have to be quarantined for 2 weeks unless I book a hotel for 2 weeks, then I don't have to be quarantined, no matter if I'm a Spanish passport or not, right? This complexity for business when you have to travel is going to be significant, and definitely you should look for solutions to help you. Last question then, you will have to sell the enterprise to pay for it, or how is it priced, right? Do I pay per transferring person? How does it work?
Yeah, so typical to probably much of the core enterprise SaaS that you're used to in terms of annual license for the technology. I would say in almost all cases these days, as I'm working with organizations, there's a pretty highly positive ROI and a relatively quick payback period. And that's been a big driver, I think, of where we've seen folks making investment decisions, even in the time of crisis and this uncertainty of COVID, because they can say, okay, we're spending $200 million a year on mobility. For a fraction of that, we can get technology in place which will help us optimize that 200 million, and it becomes quickly funding for itself. Yep. The other side is often we'll see organizations spending quite a bit of money on outsourced services, whether it's a Big Four partner or otherwise, paying sort of per transaction or per hour for frankly pretty expensive consultants. And right. So, one of the things we'll often work through is building that business case for change, and the numbers stack up pretty nicely for change, which is surprising, I think, to many folks. They expect a little bit more of a challenge with the sale, but I think with the right numbers and the right methodology, you can build that case for change and get the organization on board for that investment.